It's December 5th, 1958, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Hello, operator. I've no need for you anymore. Go away. Because it was today in history in 1958 that British people were first able to telephone each other over long distances using automation rather than having to speak to an operator who'd manually connect your call and then silently judge you first. And the first person to make such a call? Her Majesty the Queen.
We could tell that from your impression, obviously. Yeah. I mean, it has to be said, for a milestone event, it wasn't the most scintillating chat. She said, "This is the Queen speaking from Bristol. Good afternoon, my Lord Provost." To which Sir Ian Anderson Johnson Gilbert in Edinburgh replied, "May I, with humble duty, offer you the loyal greetings of the citizens of Edinburgh?" Kind of an amusing way to introduce... I mean, it's like cutting edge. Britain is in the modern era tech, and it's being introduced through this formalised conversation between the Queen and the Lord Provost. Astonishingly, they eked out this level of banter for just over 2 minutes. And it has to be said, the most entertaining part came after they hung up, when Prince Philip turned to the engineers and quipped, "You can relax now, chaps, it all works."
It's funny, it made me think of that thing that people say to each other, that the King and now the Queen must think that the world smells of fresh paint because everything has just been repainted before they get to see it. And, they must also have a really distorted idea of how the English language sounds, given that everyone is trying to put in their most formal register every time they speak to them.
An engineer who was there, Brian Fox, later recalled the preparations at Bristol's Central Telephone Exchange for the royal arrival. He says, "The walkway from Telephone Avenue was tented and full of flowers, and a powder room for the Queen was hastily provided in a converted control room."
Well, it was a big deal. It was important that they got everything right.
What if she needs to wee, you guys? She might need to wee.
I mean, I think it's important that they had a script, even though it sounds stilted, because otherwise, I mean, you remember how for the first 5 years of FaceTime, all calls on FaceTime were basically about FaceTime. It would have been like that, wouldn't it? "Hey, Lord Provost, you'll never guess what. I haven't had to speak to an operator." "You haven't had to speak to an operator, Mum. By Jove."
But anyway, up until this point, people using telephones in the UK to dial long distance had to go via an operator when they wanted to reach somebody. But the General Post Office, which ran the early telephone network, was just really eager to update the technology. And so they spent £3.5 million modernising the network to try to catch up with the popularity of telephone usage in the US, because people obviously weren't using the phones as much here because they just weren't as useful.
This subscriber trunk dialing, it was called, or unfortunately abbreviated to STD, was indeed to compete with America. If you look at the numerical codes that were put in place on this day, it's a very efficient British take on organising the world's telephone numbers. The level of detail is really impressive. I had no idea. So, for example, every landline phone number started with 0. London was 01. But every other city in the UK, the second digit corresponded to the first letter of the city name on the telephone dial, which I've sort of subliminally been aware of but never really thought out loud before. So Birmingham was 02, Edinburgh was 03, Glasgow was 04, Liverpool 05, and Manchester 06.
The reason why they wanted to do this particular call from Bristol to Edinburgh was because, well, Edinburgh being 300 miles away from Bristol, this was the greatest distance that a trunk call could be made at the time. And so they were basically showing off.
Yeah, it was a bit underwhelming compared to what was going on in the United States, where transcontinental direct dialing was already possible. International subscriber dialing first came on the scene in 1963, when Londoners were able to call Paris, just specifically one city to another city dialing. Londoners were later able to call New York City in 1970, and then eventually you got to the point where you could call anywhere, not just your friend had to go to like the major city of their country in order to receive your phone call automatically.
But it took a really long time for all of Great Britain to be connected to the trunk system. It was 1976 that the last manual exchange in the United Kingdom, Portree in the Isle of Skye, was closed.
The other thing that this new system did once it was finally with everyone, which, took 2 decades, was that it made phone calls cheaper. The Queen's 2-minute phone call cost the equivalent of 4p, and under the old system it would have been 19p. And I guess that's because it was really expensive to maintain these central systems where you had an operator.
Yeah, but I mean, worth stressing that prior to this day, most calls weren't being manually connected by fast-talking, no-nonsense dames. In fact, I think the era we most associate with operators, the 1940s, was actually a time when operator jobs were being slashed due to automation, which was finally taking off decades after the technology had first been developed. It was actually really slow to take hold. The first automatic exchange was patented in the US in 1889. It was by a guy called Almond B. Stroger, who was a funeral director in Kansas City. And the story goes that he discovered that his local operator was the wife of a rival funeral director and was connecting Stroger's prospective clients to her husband.
Oh my God, that's good. That's dark. I mean, yeah, so if you were making a local call for decades before this, even in Britain, you could without speaking to an operator, which is why, like my father-in-law, until about 10 years ago, would pick up his phone and say the last four digits, 2691 or whatever, because that was the legacy of it. Most people were calling locally, and so you only needed four numbers to remember, and you'd be able to get through to someone. But who was dialing, nationally, apart from people like the Queen? But then obviously, once the technology was available, it became very popular to make more and more phone calls. And push-button phones as well in 1966 made direct dialing even easier, the cordless phone in 1983. And this day in history was also the day that they launched the pips for payphones, so that you knew when you needed to top it up with more money. They didn't have a system in place for that before today. So you just get cut off. Whereas they actually created in Britain that thing of it going boop, 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 and you realising, I need to put some more money in the thing.
On the one hand, you feel sympathetic for all of the people who lost their jobs because of this innovation. But on the other hand, when you read about what conditions were like at telephone exchanges, it sounded totally brutal because at its peak, there were hundreds of thousands of women being employed in places with telephone exchanges all around the world. But the work itself was so full on. They often, particularly in the US, they tended to have dress codes which were very, very strict. Operators had to work for very long hours. They weren't allowed any sort of rest breaks. They weren't even allowed to make any noise in the switchboard because I suppose then you'd be distracting people around you. So they were brutal places to work. And, it's not surprising that quite a lot of strike activity started to begin because conditions were so rough.
I do support the dress code, though. I mean, that's why I asked you all to wear black tie. Just because you're on audio doesn't mean you shouldn't make an effort.
I was going to say, it just seems like such a devilish detail to be like, well, they won't be able to see you, but we'll be able to see you. Make sure you dress smartly. It wasn't just what they were wearing as well. It was their actual bodies. Exchanges were very tightly packed because they were sitting, all these women right next to each other in front of the switchboards. Applicants had to meet height, weight and arm length requirements just to be considered for a role. And even though the work was so hard, I mean, the level of employee monitoring is very reminiscent of a modern call centre. They were constantly being watched to make sure they weren't whispering or smiling or giggling. And actually in 1899, the coroner at an inquest into the suicide of a San Francisco operator directly attributed her mental distress to, quote, the espionage to which telephone girls are constantly subjected. But even so, hundreds of thousands of women wanted to work at these jobs. We talked about it a bit in our episode on the typewriter. The turn of the century was a time when office work was becoming an acceptable occupation for a young unmarried woman, especially compared to working as a domestic servant or in a factory. And telephone operator came to be seen as a kind of an extension of that kind of, clerical office role to which women might respectably aspire.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Like with the air stewardesses that we talked about in our episode about that ultimately men and women together felt more comfortable with women taking this efficient but subservient role. Men, I suspect, felt uncomfortable asking other men to connect their calls for them. Or maybe it was posh women felt uncomfortable about asking men to connect their calls for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how much of that has lasted into the contemporary world. Major tech companies had to diversify the gender of voices that were given to digital personal assistants because, in the early days, Siri was female and Google Home was female and there was no alternative because people just assumed that that's a role that should be played by women.
But this wasn't actually, today in history, the first time that a monarch had been involved in a significant technological innovation regarding the phones. The first private connection in Britain was made by Queen Victoria from Osborne House on the Isle of Wight to Sir Thomas Biddulph, also at Osborne Cottage, so next door, in January 1878. And it was after that telephone exchanges were developed. And I just kind of hope that we can continue this tradition throughout the centuries, so that every time there's a new technological innovation, the royals do it first.
We call in the king or queen to have AI sex.
Prince William sends the first aubergine DM via whatever platform is around the corner.
Exactly.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at CLUB RETROSPECTORS. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.